Besides basic movement testing, this is what the game initially looked like. This version of Level 1 has been mostly kept the same in terms of general layout. Level 1 was very useful for figuring out how the game should work. Levels 2 and 3 were designed with the premise that every level should be different in some way. However, many aspects of how Level 1 should be played are present. After the initial versions, there were 3 core improvements that could be made. One improvement was that the momentum you gain after performing a wall bounce was far too oppressive, and felt like you had given up control of your player. Another issue was that players could finish the levels too quickly. Wall bouncing allowed players to quickly elevate above most of the level. The game is designed to allow players to skip certain sections, but this was far too powerful. These two issues could both be fixed with movement reworks, which would later be accomplished. Another fix for the issue of speed was being planned later, inspired by another game I made a few months ago. One of the reasons why the game is designed to allow the player to skip certain sections is because I believe making the game broken is one of the best ways to make some players have fun. Making the game good means you have to compete with games that possess a budget greater than your parents' internet costs. However, if you deliberately allow the player to break the game in a controlled way, then you are not competing with good games. While I have polished the game significantly, I still believe if the game is too polished it will become drastically more boring. This sounds counterintuitive, and to a certain extent it is. The audience this game attracts will likely be limited. However, many people find figuring out exploits in a game to be an enjoyable part of the game. It stimulates a creative and skill-based process, as the player tries to perform a difficult task that is not immediately obvious. However, the third issue was to do with the graphics, which have been solved to a certain extent. One big part of the graphics that would not be present in the next big fix is that the textures still look awful. However, many aspects have been fixed. For example, one complaint is that the bright colors are hard to look at, as my friend over Discord subtly implied. The final objective at this stage in development was not fully realized, but I knew that the top of the highest building was going to be the objective. I don't know entirely why, but I had this concept that the game should always progress upwards. Upon reflection, this was a good idea as it made the player have a sense of progression, and meant that at the end a player can look down and contemplate their accomplishment. A solve that limits the amount of area the player can skip are these orbs, which are referred to as data packets in the game's story on its download website. The game's story has little importance, I mostly just made it because I like science fiction. The orbs means the player has to visit certain points on the map, thus meaning they can't walk up to a wall and wall bounce to the next level in one easy go. Exploits are encouraged, however if I deem one exploit too easy to accomplish then I am inclined to fix it. Exploits are fun, but feeling that something was too easy is not. This footage is after I fixed most of the 3 main issues. One of my friends suggested the game would be fun if the player could speed up when in the air. I agreed, and started tinkering around with the idea. I found that the momentum actually cancels out most of the force applied after you bounce off a wall, meaning that the only balancing factor of the wall bounce was negated. Initially the way I tackled handling the wall bounce was forcing the player to be moved away. The player however could move so fast this didn't happen. This accidentally fixed the issue of wall bounce movement feeling too oppressive, but raised the issue that players could get anywhere anytime they wanted. I fixed this by finally deciding to add a wall bounce limiter. This also meant I had control over how powerful certain exploits are. This wall bounce limiter meant after a certain point you have to touch the floor in order to wall bounce again. You can also observe that the bright colors have been toned down. On top of this graphical change, the objects you jump on now resemble buildings significantly more. My brother helped design the buildings, as he wanted a chance to help out. As such you can see he turned typical boxes into ones with doors and windows. It was very impressive for his first time using Blender. You can also observe that the bright colors have been toned down. On top of this graphical change, the objects you jump on now resemble buildings significantly more. My brother helped design the buildings, as he wanted a chance to help out. As such you can see he turned typical boxes into ones with doors and windows. It was very impressive for his first time using Blender. Overall the graphical upgrade is immense, despite shortcomings of mine such as lack of good textures. The only problem I find with this is it is far more gritty. Sure, this makes sense with the story, but it would be nice if the buildings had a calming effect. I found this with the original, as I didn't find the blinding colors as unbearable. However, it is hard to find something calming when it makes you want to rip out your retina. So here is the code I made. This is the script I used to operate the camera. The first thing this script does is it stops the mouse from moving and makes it invisible. Then, each frame, it constantly checks if you have moved your mouse. If you move your mouse up or down, it stores it in a variable called mousewide, then multiplies the amount you moved your mouse by 100 to make sure the movement is noticeable, as well as multiplying by the time it has taken since the last frame so your mouse doesn't move faster if you have a higher frame rate. It does the same with horizontal mouse movement. This code basically detects if the player has collided with anything. It then destroys the thing if it is an orb and adds 1 to your score. Every frame it changes the text on your screen so that it matches the score, and thus the amount of orbs that have been destroyed. This script controls movement. As such, it is the longest of the 3 scripts by far. This section basically draws a bunch of lines that try to detect whether the player is touching the ground or any walls. It stores this information as a set of Boolean variables, basically meaning they are either true or false. Whenever these variables are referenced, they will tell the rest of the script whether the player is touching any walls or floors. Nothing much happens here. Basically it attaches itself to the player and says they can double jump and do 4 wall jumps before touching the ground. It also determines how close the player has to be to an object before they are considered to be touching it. This section controls what happens when the player presses the space bar. If you press space, it will normally push you up by adding an upwards force. However, this only happens either if you are on the ground or have not made a double jump yet. It can also make you wall bounce, which basically pushes you upwards and away from the wall. It also allows you to make another double jump. However, you can only make 4 wall jumps before you have to touch the ground. This just moves the character forwards, backwards, left and right. Specifically, it moves the character by creating a vector and describing a single direction. It determines the speed of movement by multiplying a base speed by the time it has taken since the last frame. In this case, you can see the base speed is 6. It multiplies by the time it has taken since the last frame because otherwise a faster frame rate will make you move faster, and thus the game will behave differently based on what computer you are using. This is some relatively recent code I added. This and the wall bounce limiter are the most recent revisions I have made of the game, as previously explained. Basically, one of my friends suggested that it would be fun if the player sped up mid-air. I didn't want the player to accelerate when grounded because that didn't sound very balanced at all, but the notion of mid-air acceleration sounded interesting as I imagined that would create another skill-based component. The game forces you to eventually touch the ground to progress, but seeing how long you can avoid this to build momentum is interesting. What happens here is that it checks to see if you are grounded, and if you are not it adds force in the direction you are moving. This force builds up, meaning it accelerates you. While the other 2 of Newton's laws are not present in Unity, inertia is. This means I had to significantly increase the friction levels on the ground so the player comes to a very sudden halt on contact with the ground as to ensure they do not slide across the ground after landing. There is definitely a far more elegant solution, but I am not very smart and elegant solutions are for nerds. This feature did create the problem of the player moving so fast they can link infinite wall bounces together. This was not a problem previously, as mentioned, due to the player being physically unable to move against the momentum of a wall bounce. However, I had to add a wall bounce limiter to stop the infinite wall bounce glitch. It was a dumb solution I should probably have added earlier. Ignore the debug log stuff, they are just leftovers from testing the mechanism.